Good evening and welcome to tonight's Guardian Live event. For those of you that do use Twitter, we'd love to hear from you during and after the show. Please use #GuardianLive, but do keep your phones on silent. Now, please put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to tonight's guests.
Oh, yeah, you may. Is that a thing? Perfect. Hello there. Thank you all for coming. Welcome. I'm Jonathan Freedland. I write for The Guardian, as I think pretty well everyone up here does. Gary is making my point for me about turning your phones onto silent. We believe in leading by example here, as you can see. Let me tell you something about the format for the evening. We've got 90 minutes, which is really good. At that point, we go into extra time and then penalties, which we will then be out of Europe after that. The format is going to be that we'll use half the time up here to have a conversation back and forth that I'll be sort of steering, and then I want to open it up and hear from all of you, obviously. And you know, I'll take clusters of questions and then bring them back to people here. And the focus, obviously, of our discussion is last Thursday's decision. Before we plunge right in and I introduce the panel, I thought it would be quite useful just for everyone to have a sense of who's in the room and where we're all coming from. So I'm going to ask you to with the show of hands, tell me how you voted. We can probably guess how this may work out, but let's try it. So if you voted Remain, please raise a hand. And if you voted Leave now, will you raise a hand? Okay, yeah, you're on the winning side, so don't feel bad, right? Okay, maybe in this room, but generally you were in the majority. Okay, let me say something then about our panel and introduce them, and then, as I say, we'll get straight into it. So, starting on my far right, but it's purely a physical thing, is The Guardian's political editor Anushka Asthana. And I thought I would mention that actually in quite an innovation in political reporting, Anushka shares that job with Heather Stewart. I think it's the very first time there's been a job share of a political editorship.
Yeah, that's right.
In sort of history of the lobby, so that's a good and big thing. Right next to me here, you've been following his reporting on video and in writing as well, John Harris. Former US correspondent and fellow columnist of mine, Gary Younge. A contributor, especially in these recent weeks, you've been writing for us a lot about Brexit, and I think it's fair to say, you know, you surprised a lot of people because you were writing pro-Leave, but you're also obviously an acclaimed critic and crime writer, Dree Mitchell. And completing the panel, formerly of the BBC, of Newsnight and Channel 4 News, and now a writer and columnist for The Guardian, among other things, Paul Mason. So beforehand, this is the only preparation I've given anybody. I have asked each of our panelists to come up with a single reason why they think the vote went the way it did last week. Obviously, all of them are paid to come up with dozens and dozens of reasons, but I've asked them to really focus on one. And so I'll, in no particular order, why don't we start with you, Paul Mason, one reason why the Leave won and Remain lost.
Well, many people in this room, judging from the way their hands went, I also voted Remain, will be going through a kind of existential crisis of the self, in the sense that, you know, the institution many of us have based our lives, we've assumed it's been there, the European Union. It's the source of our law. It's the source of our understanding of democracy, insofar as there is any, but also it underpins our understanding of social justice. Many of us, our life chances have gone. Some of our young people's life chances in our world feel their life chances are over. And our sense of self, who we are, Europeans, has been completely challenged by this. Well, that's how it feels to be working class. And if in 20 years' time your kids are offered the chance to get one back against the people who did this to them in one single vote, that's what they'll do. And I think our failure as a Remain side was not to parrot a bunch of upper class and elite, essentially scare stories and half-truths. Our failure was to connect with the people who voted for Leave. And we failed to connect with them, not only because we didn't speak their language or whatever. Lots of Labour people speak their language. We didn't have a story for them about how their lives would be better if they voted to Remain. And that's why I think we lost.
Okay. Thank you. Anushka, you've been following this really closely all from the beginning of the campaign. In one reason why it went Leave rather than Remain.
I think that people felt disenfranchised all over the country. I think that globalisation had dramatically changed their lives, that jobs and wages were less secure than they used to be, that people were struggling to find affordable housing, that they felt that some bygone era had passed them by, that communities weren't as tight as they used to be, and I felt that in places of both low and high immigration, they felt that the level of immigration was a problem that was causing a lot of those other things that were going on in their life. And I think that Europe was symbolic of that type of immigration. I think they were partly right and partly wrong, but I think that is why they voted out.
Thank you. Drida, I'm guessing you didn't think you were going to be on the winning side. Tell me if you did or not, but anyway, you're one reason for why your side in the end did prevail.
Okay, I think it's picking up on what Paul actually says about people feeling disconnected. But people have been feeling disconnected in Britain for 40-odd years since Margaret Thatcher. That's how long people have felt they haven't had a voice. That's how long people have felt they felt disenfranchised. And, you know, there's a saying from Malcolm X, really, when people have got nothing to lose, they're dangerous. And that's how people felt. They had nothing absolutely to lose. And here is their platform. They took their platform and they actually voiced their concerns through that platform. And I also think us in London, because I think this is another big reason, is that people outside of London, you know, when I go up and I speak to my family in Sheffield, they just think the people in London just think Britain is about London. And I have to say, you know, Paul was talking about feeling European. I have never felt European in my life. And I talk to people in my family, they've never felt European in my life. And I think what people were presented with was with a system, a kind of a fait accompli. And actually, as the years have gone on, people have started to think for themselves, here is my opportunity, I don't want to be part of this. And actually, what I'm voicing is, I'm British like everybody else. I've got a stake in this. If you're talking about there's prosperity, I want to be part of that prosperity as well. And I think that's something that all of us should think about, really. Yeah.
Thank you. John.
I agree with just about all of those three reasons. When I, as I do for a living really, went travelling around with my Guardian colleague John Domokos making films and doing reports, one thing that struck me was we'd say to people, we'd say to people, are there any politicians who've impressed you in the course of this campaign? Because if you watched the TV or picked up most newspapers, you would have thought this was really just about Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Jeremy Corbyn, if you were lucky. You know, it was all through the prism of politicians because the media still has decided that politics is politicians. There wasn't a single person we spoke to, I don't think. One woman in Merthyr Tydfil who said she liked Michael Gove, who I thought was a museum piece. I was like, wow. But 99% of people said, I don't like any of them. And they said they're both lying, Leave and Remain, you know. And I suppose what that pointed up was the fact that, as has been said about other factors in this has been going on for years. Politics has fallen into disrepute. The reason that's happened, among many others, is that the parties aren't presences in places anymore. They're not part of the social fabric. It's particularly pronounced on the Labour side, because Labour was about the trade unions and historically the nonconformist church, heavy industry, etc. And it's not there. And in place of that, you have a professionalised political class who speak in this very strangulated vernacular about hard-working families and all of this, which doesn't resonate with anybody. I mean, thanks for patting me on the head. I do work hard, but you know, I don't need you to remind me. Is usually what people say. So there was a vacuum. No one was listening. And I think people made up their minds to a lesser or greater extent based on conversations with their family and friends, a sense of place, a sense of what was happening locally and what wasn't happening. And that applied just as much in Leicester and Herefordshire, quite a wealthy rural Tory stronghold, to northern Manchester or Tidville, or these supposedly core Labour seats that we went to, you know. So I think that was a really, really striking thing, this sense of a vacuum. And although I say most people made it, or people largely made up their minds based on conversations they had with people, I think not politicians, but I did pick up in lots of places, I don't think people have been brainwashed at all, but if you walk in a newsagent shop every day for 30 years and it says migrant this and foreigner that on the front of the Sun and the Daily Mail, and latterly that psychotic newspaper, the Daily Express, don't tweet that, please, anybody, then that definitely opened the way for this. There's absolutely no question. Because when people say the country's full, or, you know, I've heard a load of migrants have just arrived yesterday, you just nip in W.H. Smith and it's all there. Mm.
Gary.
I'm going to assume that Anushka's thing was disenfranchisement, and therefore I'm going to say neoliberal globalization. I think that we live in this system, global system, where at the press of a button someone can move capital to where labour's cheaper and unions are weaker, where regulation is less, and that forces people to move. First of all, because they have to move to where the jobs are. And when one group of people move geographically, everybody moves socially, whether you've moved or not. And so you have this moment where governments actually have less power than business. So politicians can say what they like, really. It's kind of quite performative politics. And people reach for the most obvious expression or surrogate of that anxiety, which would be, in this case, migrants as a kind of, as an unsettling thing. And I think, if you woke up on Friday and wondered, what is this country I'm living in? If there was that feeling of disorientation, imagine what it's like to be a 60-year-old, a pensioner in Redcar, and to have woken up every day, and to have seen industry gone, and community decimated, and basically jobs leave, and foreign people come in, and at some stage you're like, I have no ownership over my life. And so here came this referendum, where people got a chance, in a way, to say, fuck this and fuck you. Mm. And they took it. And while there are only certain people who are responsible for the fact that this vote took place, i.e. Cameron, and how the vote happened, to some extent, we've all been complicit in making that situation possible. These forgotten people, well, somebody forgot them. They didn't forget themselves.
Thank you. So, let me just follow up a few things. It's interesting how much convergence there is between that. Firstly, before the event tonight, we asked Guardian readers to submit questions and contributions of their own, and I'm going to mention a few of them as we go through. So John Allen, before tonight, said, have the traditional Labour voters swung it to out because of their frustration? And in a way, that's a lot of what you're putting up. So the one question is that you've all, in a way, focused on that block of voters, and yet actually, you look at the traditional Tory vote, and that went overwhelmingly for Leave, and a lot of those people are not left behind, and they have actually done quite well out of, globalisation, and we're not talking about them. So, in a way, we've accepted John Allen's premise. The important thing are the people you've been reporting on.
I don't quite buy that.
So why? I don't think in any of your answers were you talking about
it goes to
that sort of Tory land.
Point. I think the point about what an imbalanced country we are, and this idea that there is London, and that sort of gets everything up to and including this Garden Bridge. There are very sort of vivid examples of this every week. that applies, you don't feel it as keenly, and it doesn't chime with a sense of borderline desperation as it probably does in Collyhurst in Manchester or that area. Is there an area of Sheffield or Leeds called Little London? Is it Leeds? These are all Leeds, right? So these places that you go to, the sort of bywords for the left behind deprivation and so on. But in Leicester and Herefordshire, or equally, probably quite affluent places. I mean, I'm from Wilmslow in Cheshire. So that's an affluent place and a half now. It wasn't quite as much when I was growing up, but that apparently was absolutely festooned with Leave posters, because they probably feel it as well, that they're not...
Not for that reason, though.
That they're not London.
No, because those people voted... You gave us one reason, yeah? So there's obviously more than one reason. Lots of people voted because of sovereignty and democracy and control, and not because of immigration. But it wasn't them that took it over 50%.
Right.
And I think that's the difference.
Yeah.
It was what took it from something that people like... Well, actually, for Nigel Farage, it obviously was about immigration. But for people who had felt this for 20 years...
Bill Cash,
Yeah.
say.
There's something that took it away from Bill Cash and to people who, I tell you what, the person they were looking for wasn't Bill Cash. Bill Cash wasn't the answer to their problems, but somehow voting out was.
So on similar lines, I was going to ask you about this, Paul, and in a way it goes to Gary as well. This thing about people, they wanted to stick it to London, the establishment, the elite, and they had a chance and they took it. Completely get that. But why was this the vehicle? Why did this become the outlet? Because in a way, just what Anushka said there raises this. For years, this was a weird, sort of quite fringe cause. Yeah. It was an eccentric cause within the sort of pinstriped wing of the Tory party, the people who had this as a kind of obsession. And even in this campaign, Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, the idea that this became the outlet for this howl of rage that you're describing.
Well, this is why I'm so angry at Osborne, for trying to step one final below-the-belt punch in his final statement, which was meant to be calming the markets. He had to get in that he'd rebuilt the economy while the sun was shining, didn't he? Now, if you think about it, I think we'll look at it, now historians will look at it, as quite incremental, because he's done several things. First of all, austerity. Okay? So austerity means that there's a limited pot. And if everybody signs up to it, and thank goodness Labour didn't under Corbyn, if everybody signs up to it, then the starting point of the debate, whether it's the Mirror or the Express, is there's a limited pot to go around and it's shrinking. The next thing he did to stimulate the recovery is QE, which stimulates what? The biggest crunch for the young people on housing costs there's ever been. Even during this 2008 boom, there hasn't been a crunch like this. And this is true in wherever we want to talk about, Newport, the valleys. Housing costs are really high. And then wage stagnation. Now, wages have recovered, but only to where they were in 2008. So people have lived through 8 years of wage stagnation, thanks to George Osborne's policy. Now, I think this combined thing of wage stagnation and rising housing costs, and then all the austerity creates a narrative. And when we as I'm a Remain but Reform lefty on the European Union for this vote. Strategically, I'm quite happy to have a Lexit, but it's not on the agenda. When I've tried to argue with people, they go, yeah, but with austerity and with rising housing costs and with wage stagnation, you say it's not migrants, and I can accept what you're saying, but if there was less migration, then all of these things would affect us less. And the problem is, you then say, well, let's try and do something about that with higher minimum wage, or let's crack down on slave labour employers. And they go, no, there's a really easy way to do it, mate. Just vote out of the European Union. And I found myself, really having to dig into my intellectual resources to argue with that. And a lot of the time, it's not with racists. It's with just people who are not personally racist. They might have an imperial mindset, but what I mean is that they don't hate people from other cultures.
No, I just have such difficulty with this. I grew up in East London, and I suppose I'm having real difficulty with, after the vote, I'm hearing white working class people being called uneducated, being called thickos. It's all us in London who are the educated one. We know best. We tell them what to do. Yeah. And for years, the community that I grew up in, and it's not just white working class people, it's people who are black and minority ethnic as well. I think of people in my family who voted Leave, who say the reason they haven't spoken up for years is because they were always frightened people would call them racist. That has been the fear. So people have been living in fear that if they spoke up, people just wouldn't be able to understand what they were talking about. You're great, Paul, because this is your job, you know, so you can untangle it all. If you can imagine you're an ordinary person trying to get people to understand what you're talking about, they fear that, really. So people have taken this platform as a way out. But most people are not racist. They are not racist. They aren't.
I want to get readers in here because there's been, on exactly this point, this is R. Mills Morrow. Like many, I feel helpless, disenfranchised, that word again, and completely demoralised after double whammy of unexpected Tory majority followed by this shocking Brexit. The Leave campaign has been ugly, racist and packed with lies. Its success makes me mortified to be British and really bloody angry. This is the bit that's important. I don't think I'm alone in feeling less than compassionate towards older people and the Labour left behinds. These turkeys have voted for Christmas and will be eaten alive when there's no money to put the oven on. At the moment, I think they deserve whatever's coming, and I'm shocked at the depth of my feelings. My question is, how do we move forward with positivity, kindness, faith in humanity after such a heavy kick in the metaphorical borders? But then John Allen then said, sorry, not John Allen, I quoted him before, Ian Barker said, unprecedented turnout of those who have been marginalised by neoliberal consensus probably led to the Leave victory. I don't write them off as irredeemable racists. On the contrary, many had little to gain from a Remain vote and may have voted for the chance of something different. And then he asked how we could construct a progressive policy. So where are we all on this question of the anti-immigration thing, which I think a couple of you mentioned? It feels central in this campaign one way or another. You know, it's that 2005 question that Michael Howe put on his posters, is it racist to have a problem with immigration? He said it wasn't racist, but let's just unpack that a bit. Anushka, why don't you go for this first, then we'll hear from Gary.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's not racist for 17 million people to vote out. 17 million people in this country are not racist. I went to a lot of different parts of the country on the issue of immigration to talk to people. I met black people in Dalston. I met Asian people in other parts of the country. I met a Polish immigrant in Lee in the northwest, where, by the way, there are hardly any immigrants, shouting at me about the thousands of immigrants in her street. It's not racist, but there are two things I would say. First of all, the fact that so many people voted because they are deeply uncomfortable with the level of immigration makes immigrants, a lot of them, and the children of immigrants, people like me, feel quite uncomfortable about it. But secondly, I think it's true that it's not racist, but it's also not completely true that immigration is their problem. I went to Peterborough, where immigration had had a massive impact in the area, and where, whatever figures people give you, the hospitals and the health centres and the schools were heavily affected by immigration. And it was an impact, and people were voting out because of it. I went to Lee, where there was hardly any people, you know, I asked a black woman, whose daughter didn't get a school place, why are you voting out? And she said, because of all the immigrants. I said, how many do you think there are here? She said 80 or 90%. It was actually under 4%. But do you know what? It didn't make any difference for me to say what the number was. That's not the point. The point is, she didn't have her school place. And until somebody gave her school place, none of this would go away. And so I don't think it's racist, and I don't think we should be patronising. But I also don't think we should allow people to take over the debate and say it's all about immigration. It is complicated. Absolutely. Lives have changed, and there needs to be a policy answer to that.
Gary's going to come in. I just want to have this hanging, or you can either pick it up or somebody else will, but whether or not, if and I know it's a massive hypothetical, but if a political party both promised and it did relieve the pressure on public services, did give that parent a school place, and did make sure there was enough resource in the local hospital and built the houses, would there still be a question about immigration? In other words, it's part of this cultural rather than just economic. So I just want to have that in there. Somebody can pick it up. Gary.
First of all, I think it's possible to understand that this vote was not primarily driven by racism. That if that were true, then UKIP would do far better than it does, BNP would do far better than it does, as a country would be in a different place. It's possible to understand that, and also not be in denial that racism had something to do with it, that there is racism in this country. We've seen that in the few days after the vote. We've seen that over many years, BNP, National Front, a section of the UKIPs. Though there's no point in being in denial that this country, like most Western countries, has a problem with racism. It's just not the primary lens through which we can or should understand this thing. Now, I was in actually an identical situation. I arrived in August and I could not get a school place in the area, like right around where I lived, for my son. And as a result, have to kind of travel 15, 20 minutes for another place in a Hackney Comprehensive. I do think there's a choice here. My feeling was, this is a problem of resources. I could have chosen to say this is a problem with immigrants. And that, it doesn't work to say, well, you're really comfortable, and therefore I didn't feel very comfortable having my kid out of school. And I was looking for someone to blame, and I decided to blame the people with the resources. And
you could theoretically have gone the other way. That's the point.
I could have.
Yeah.
And herein lies one of the kind of most perverse things about this campaign for me, was that the very people in the Leave campaign who, because the question of immigration in a sense is a question of resources. If I think, to answer your point, when the economy is doing well, people worry less about immigration. That's always been true. It's less of an issue. And so we have this period of austerity, and the people who are leading this austerity have decided that the way to confront the issues that we have is to slash resources and actually redistribute money from the poor to the rich. And just a second. And they are the very ones, having taken those resources away, saying to people, the immigrants have got your resources. Well, actually, those people took their resources away. And if we'd had a decent conversation about austerity, about its meaning, about its victims, then I think we would be better poised to actually have that conversation. But what happened in this vote was that we ended up with this backlog of things that we have never been honest about. We've never been honest about immigration. We've never been honest about patriotism and flag and country and anthem and colonies and empire and all that kind of stuff. We've not been honest about our economy, and then suddenly, with a week to go before the election, it's like, oh, well, let's have a proper conversation about this. It's too late by then.
Okay, because there are big other issues I want to get into. So I know you've both been trying to get into. So really quick, if you can, Paul and John, and then I want to ask something about what happens next in terms of our relationship with Europe.
I should admit, I am from Lee. We used to not really like people from the next town, Wigan, and that's a serious issue as well. But one, I think there was why it went over 52% was what Gramsci used to call ideological hegemony. That is, people who really wanted to leave were exerting influence into families that were wavering, and people said, yeah, I can feel your pain, and they couldn't feel the other side's pain. And then the other thing is about the European Union. Maurice Glassman, the Labour peer, who's a bit maverick and probably veered, seemed to be veering towards Brexit at the end.
He did vote. Yeah. He said he voted for Brexit.
So Glassman wrote a very good piece, I thought, about the European Union's concept of the citizen is of an abstract economic person. And therefore, it's not, whatever we did wrong, in terms of my town, Lee, had a whole influx after World War II of Polish and Ukrainian miners, many of whom had been displaced from the war, many of whom were not particularly very progressive people, but we don't know what they did in World War II, but they were taken into Lee and they were welcomed eventually by the population. Yeah, but by the time I was in school in 1960, you couldn't tell who they were. They had funny names, but they spoke like us. They'd completely assimilated. It's not the fault of Polish people or Lithuanians if they do not assimilate. The fact is the European Union's model of migration is that the abstract economic person, move anywhere, don't bother, names on the cenotaph, don't even look them up, just plonk yourself in this space, open a shop, even better, sprinkle the fairy dust of globalisation on poor drab Lee and get on with it. And the fault has to lie with our European concept of citizenship. We don't have that problem anymore, sadly. The European concept of citizenship is completely economic and non-social.
Good, okay, got it. John, quickly if you can.
Okay. There are two things. I mean, you said if we somehow solve this question about public services and even labour markets, would it would it begin to solve the issue? It might take a lot of the sting out of it. But there are so many parts of this which are almost uncontrollable. I mean, without having a kind of local command economy, I don't even know how you get to grips with them. Because things move so fast, you know. So if you go to Wiz Beach, for example, in Cambridgeshire, I think it is, where I've been a couple of times, if you go to Boston in Lincolnshire, most of the housing market is owned by private landlords. They'll put people 5 or 6 to a room. And so whole streets seem to change in 5 minutes, you know. And then people might go home if there's an economic downturn. Then another load of people arrive. And people feel very, very disorientated. It's about the pace of change as much as it's about resource allocation, notwithstanding the idea that if you spent more. But politics is in disrepute. So if you say, look, don't worry, we'll build more houses, we'll fund hospitals better, they say, no, you won't. Because the Labour Party never did, really, as far as house building was concerned when it was in power. So the people take all that with a huge dose of salt. I'll say something that might be a bit controversial here. One sort of left-wing trope I kept hearing through this campaign was, isn't it funny how people in low areas of immigration are still opposed to immigration, like somehow they were sort of deluded?
That's not what I meant.
It's funny, isn't it?
But you're thinking of a place like Lee where they thought it was 90%, but it was really 4%.
But it's funny, isn't it? We allow middle-class people to be worldly and to understand events happening elsewhere because they're all on the internet and watching television. But we don't allow working-class people that. It's like their horizons end where they live. Well, there has been it's partly because of neoliberal economics, or largely, but there has been a sort of dystopian hell, really, has erupted in some of these places. Not all, by any means, but if you go to Boston in Lincolnshire, I wouldn't want to live there. And I wouldn't want to live in Wiz Beach, Cambridgeshire, either. Peterborough is a very, very tense place. Now, even if you live in a place with low levels
when you say dystopian hell, are you saying because of the rapid pace of change and migration?
And low-wage labour markets, houses of multiple occupancy, the amount of the local economy, which is illicit, so it takes in gangsterism and all that. This is all bound up in the same sort of package. Now, even if you live in a place with low levels of immigration, you go on Facebook, and there are people in Boston saying, look what immigration's done here. People are aware of it. And in an atmosphere where they are, to coin a phrase, shit scared anyway, they fear, well, that might be my town next. Okay. So it's patronising to say, how dare you vote for this despite having low levels of immigration where you live? People are aware of the wider
No,
world.
that's just saying that there's something else.
But
that's it's just saying there is also other things that are causing those problems.
Yeah. Massive. We could keep going with it. We're coming up to sort of the mark where I want to open it up. So before we do that, I just wanted to sort of speak to a sentiment which you have to speak to when you had a room full of people who said they voted Remain, which is, what should we do now about Britain's relationship with the European Union? And in the first week, there have been some who've said we should have a second referendum, because the first one was in a way sold on a false prospectus, because a lot of the people who voted, none of you mention it incidentally, and that's fine, but it is said that a lot of people voted Leave because they thought 350 million quid was going to be coming back for the NHS every week, and they thought that was a good idea. And similarly, some voted Leave because they thought immigration was going to come down, and Daniel Hannan from the Vote Leave campaign says, I don't know where you got that idea from. If you read my book, I never said anything of the sort. So there's a view that it's a false prospectus and the question should be asked again. There's another view which says, okay, we can't do that, can't rerun, look, it was lost, but there must be creative ways in which Britain can renegotiate with the European Union and come up with some new thing, maybe the Norway option, in which we have a lot of the things that were the advantages of being in the European Union, even if we're not officially part of it. And there is a kind of feeling, I feel, from a lot of the people who voted Remain, and a lot of them are Guardian readers, willing there to be some kind of solution to this. And the history of the European Union is often these things are fudged and there's some kind of compromise solution. So let's go round on that just once before we open it up, which is what happens now in terms, and what should happen now for Britain in its relationship with the European Union. Do we just say, okay, 52-48, we're out, we leave, we exit the European Union, we exit the single market, let the chips fall where they may, or do we want something else to happen? Anushka, because your job you're not an opinion bloviator like the rest of us here. You actually report what's going on for the news pages. Can you tell us just first of all what your stab is at what will happen given who's in charge and running the country? I know that's a big question in itself, but tell us how you think this may play out.
Okay, well, just very quickly on the 350 million, I think it was a really, really big part of the campaign. I sat in a focus group in Knowsley watching people, and everyone believed it. Vote Leave knew it. They used it all the way through, even if it was a bit more nuanced by the end. I think a lot of people thought Brexit was going to be a silver bullet, and therefore what actually happens now will be quite interesting because it will not be quite that silver bullet. And in many ways, it's better that you have it and you see the truth rather than that you didn't have it and you always think that there was a silver bullet that you dodged. I think what will happen now is that tomorrow, Boris Johnson will launch his Conservative campaign, and he's going to try and be not the person that you thought he was. He's going to be talking about compassionate conservatism. He's going to be talking about how he can win an election. He's going to, in fact, he already has unveiled a number of high-profile Remain Tories on his team. I have no idea how these politicians work together after what they called each other during that campaign. Even Amber Rudd, I hear, has she actually come out? Even Amber Rudd, who said he's not a man who I'd go home with, I'd have drive me home at the end of the night, might be on his team. And I think that he will say one thing, and that is that as he's the most likely person to be our Prime Minister, of course it could be Theresa May, he will have to deliver the thing that I think people voted on most of all, and that was limits on freedom of movement. However much it might hurt people in this room, that is what people voted on. It is what they did. We cannot not have that. He will talk about a point system, and he will talk about access to the single market. Access, not membership. And that is the deal they were going to try and get. The deal is never going to be as good as they have promised. It's actually not possible for all their promises to come true, but they will try and get as far in that direction as they can. I suspect a second referendum is off the cards.
Thank you, really comprehensive. What is the, okay, so that's in a way a prognosis of what will happen. What should happen in how Britain, you voted for this, Streeter, so I'm going to be unkind and say, you call for this, what's the plan?
I'm not a politician, as you well know. No, I'm not. People can kind of laugh at that. This is what I've been battling. I'm a voter. That's how I kind of came, and that's how people responded to me, and that's how I kind of came to the platform, really. And the thing for me has always been one about democracy and sovereignty. I think what's very interesting about Europe at the moment, and I think for quite a long time, there have been shifts and changes in Europe. I think the EU at the moment, leadership, seems to be hanging quite tough, but I think they're quite scared. I think Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande are quite frightened of what's happening in France. I think people are frightened about what's happening with working class workers across Europe as well. You've got, Norbert Hofer in Austria nearly became president. You've got a rising right in Germany. You've got the Law and Justice Party in Poland. So I think it's a good time, if you like, for Britain to go in there and negotiate something. My belief about our relationship with the EU has always been that we've had a semi-detached relationship with Europe. Anushka, you'll know more about the politics than I ever would. But I agree with you, regardless of what we all might think, the issue around migration is one that people need to talk about. And
Can I just chip in on one thing?
Yeah, go on.
Just because that list of people you mentioned,
Yeah.
Marine Le Pen, Norbert Hofer,
Yeah.
they've all welcomed this Brexit vote so warmly. Does that not, as somebody who voted for it, does that not give you a little worry?
No, they will welcome it. Marine Le Pen, her platform had always been about talking about getting out of Europe.
Yeah.
No, it hasn't been actually. It was one of the reasons I wanted to vote Leave, because to tell you the truth, I didn't want us to be sat in a club where they were sat at the table. That frightens me. As a black woman, I don't want to be sat. And we talked about racism. I tell you, one of the last time I experienced racism, because we talk about the freedom of movement around Europe, it was coming back from France with some colleagues when I used to work for a local authority. And who got stopped? They were all white. Who got stopped in France? Me. And what did they ask me? How did you get a British passport? So we talk about racism and we talk about freedom of movement, but you know what? For some British citizens, when we've been moving around Europe, it's not been so free and easy.
Thank you. Let's just mop up three more on this question of what should happen now in terms of Britain's relationship. There's a whole range of options. Norway, Canada, second referendum, general election. Gary, what do you think we should be doing about our relationship with this continent?
I think there should be no do-overs. I think we voted Leave. I think it doesn't take a great power of imagination to think if the vote had gone the other way and Farage had said, well, let's have another go, would be saying, no, look, that's enough. We've had an election, we lost, and we should leave and live by the consequences of our decision. I think, obviously, I live in this country. I want them to be able to negotiate the best deal that they possibly can. But paradoxically, I think that once they were in and threatening to leave, then they had something to negotiate with. Now we're leaving. And actually, I don't think the EU has
lost our leverage.
Yeah, and I don't think the EU has any self-interest in making it easy for us. And I think that's apparent by the fact that we had this prize, leaving. That was what the Leave campaign wanted. And it had many proud and pushy parents. As soon as we voted for it, now it's an orphan. You got this Article 50 sitting there, nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to touch it. So I described it in a column recently. They're like the dog that chases the car. Dogs chase cars, but they're not supposed to catch them. And when they catch it, then what? Then what? They can't drive. And so now they've got what they wanted. And honestly, I think Boris thought it was a jape. I think it was all a jolly jape for him.
He wasn't meant to win.
Part of a strategy to become the Tory leader and so on. And so I think there are real. I think we're in a much weaker position than we were, but that we absolutely have to kind of follow through on what's been decided.
Okay, really quickly, John and Paul on the. George and Ringo will do another time, but John and Paul on this thing, on what the relationship should be like,
Okay.
Article 50, Canada, Norway models, just give us something to hold on to.
About the politics of this, I got really cross with my dad on the phone at the weekend. I got so cross that I sort of finished the conversation, and then I thought for a minute I had to phone him back 2 minutes later and apologise for getting so cross. And the reason was, he was quite taken with an argument voiced by, among other people, Geoffrey Robertson QC, David Lammy, the London MP, and Michael Heseltine, there's a holy trinity, about this idea that Parliament should stand in the way of this, right? Which is sort of in the same ballpark as this idea about having a second referendum.
Reader's question on exactly this. Jenny Benedict wrote in, is this referendum result legally binding? Isn't there a chance to raise legal objections if it's accepted as being binding? And what would the role of Parliament be in the event of a rethink, an opportunity to revise the non-binding result?
So I got really steamed up about this. Here's why. A lot of people who voted for Brexit, particularly the working class, hitherto Labour voters we were talking about, did this because they either mistrust or outright loathe Parliament, okay, and the political class. Most people, much to the surprise of the commentariat, who thought people were as bored as they were, and they weren't, they were very engaged with this referendum. They were all talking about it all the time, right? The Labour Party, as we now know, and I've been of the opinion this has been going on for 10 or 15 years, is falling apart in front of our eyes. There might be an election in 6 months. UKIP are ready to sweep through the north of England and South Wales, etc., etc. Do you not think it would be manna from heaven to Nigel Farage, either for Parliament to stand in the way of this, or for lefties en masse to shout, well, let's have a second referendum? UKIP would clean up, and then I'd have to emigrate, and so would a hell of a lot of people here, right? It's not even funny, really. I don't want to live in a country with large numbers of UKIP MPs, let alone UKIP people in the cabinet. Can you imagine an education system run by UKIP? A health system run by UKIP? We are not within sight of that, but it's conceivable, right? That's the politics of all this. So let's accept the result. The one thing that is tricky in the midst of all this, and this is echoes something Paul's written lately, is it seems to me the only way of avoiding the worst economic damage is to join the European Economic Area. And the central principle of that, as with the EU, is free movement of people. And that, again, would be a red rag to the Farage bull. It's terribly complicated.
So Paul, your field is economics. This seems to be the irresistible force meets the immovable object. For the reason John has said, you can't, to persuade people who voted against free movement of people to accept it. On the other hand, if you want access to the single market without the economy tanking, you're going to have it. How do these two get reconciled? And then we're going to open up.
So I favour Britain applying to join the European Economic Area. And I favour the progressive side of politics uniting around that demand. So Labour, the Greens, SNP, if it wants to, Plaid for definite, and even the Lib Dems, right? Why? Because it's the only economic lifeline. Because there's 500 million people that we have access to, and the other one, it is actually a leap in the dark. I.e., a series of bilateral trade deals to begin in 2 years' time, the economy will tank.
What about free movement?
Wait a minute, I'm coming to that. Now, under the EEA, you can have an emergency brake on free movement. Owen Paterson, the pro-Leaver, I debated with him yesterday on the Daily Politics. That's what they're for. Apply to EEA and then apply for an emergency brake. Now, the problem is, and I think British politics will divide over this, first of all, what kind of migration system do we want after free movement? I want a generous, outward-looking one where employers, universities, hospitals bring workers in, and that we convince our brothers and sisters of Lee, until Lee, where I come from, that this is a good thing. Right?
What makes you so certain that you can have the emergency brake inside
Right,
the
I'm
EU?
not. But the negotiating position has to start from, we'd like EEA, an emergency brake, and a generous UK-controlled migration system, because I think everything else is a recipe for economic catastrophe, and I think that we actually have the ability to do our own bit of Gramscian ideological hegemony, because in 6 months' time, these places, Newport, Old Gwen, all these places you've been to will look very different. We're going to have a -1 figure on economic growth. We're going to have stagflation.
Yeah.
Inflation will eat your wages. Your job's gone. George Osborne wants, or his successor wants, 30 billion off public spending. There's going to be a massive social debate. And if we stand firm now and say we want in the single market with some variation on free movement, we can unite the progressive half of the society. And we do it around the progressive half. I'm clear, I'm Labour, that's my base. Bristol, London, Leeds, Manchester, that's our base, and from it we go out to these other
It sounds great,
areas.
Paul. The trouble is that's what Boris says this too. Boris Johnson says this too, that you can have all the single market stuff and get this emergency brake.
No, he doesn't.
The trouble is the Europeans are not saying that's on offer.
Yeah, okay, we can discuss about that.
Okay.
But there's only today was a starting point. Our hunches, Ben Judah, I don't know who he writes for now, but he's an authoritative EU-based journalist. He reckons that the French are going to offer us the 4 freedoms. One of them is freedom of movement. Actually, the French might offer us, you get your immigration variation, but you give us the city back. So you lose the passport for the city. And the German one is the other way around. Keep the city, but you must have free movement. So that's the debate inside Europe. We go in, steaming in with, I don't care who it is, Corbyn, whoever. Corbyn, Tim Farron, even any wets on the Tories will come in and say, and Plaid and SNP, give us EEA membership, because what does it do for Scotland? Scotland will leave eventually, but at least if Scotland leaves, we don't have a border. I mean, EEA is a no-brainer.
All right. You've been very patient, all of you. We're going to open it up now. I'm going to try and see lots of hands. That's great. There are people here with microphones, so do wait for those. Why don't we bring the microphone to the lady here right in the front? There's both of you going. And then if you can get the microphone to the chap in the middle there, can you keep your hand up? Can you follow my pen there? And what you're going to do, in fact, I'll begin with you, because then when I go to the next question, if you pass the microphone behind you, there's someone waiting there. Yeah. So you start first of all. Yeah.
My question is going back to the reasons why the Leave vote won.
Yeah.
I think all the reasons given on the panel were extremely interesting, and probably there was a lot of truth in all of them. But the one thing that wasn't discussed at all was the role of the media in all this, the press and the broadcasting authorities. It seemed to me that to start with, the media were playing much of it as a game, this side and that side, who's winning, who's losing. It's a point-scoring system, but they were treating it as a joke. And I think the media has a lot to answer for in this, and I think even the BBC has a lot to answer for in this. They weren't treating topics of equal importance by saying some of these arguments are nonsense, and they weren't challenging the people who are sprouting this nonsense to hold them to account. And I think the media has failed the country in a very, very big way in all this.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. If you now pass the microphone behind you, if you can, to the chap who's been waiting 2 rows behind. Lady here. Oh, there you are. Yeah.
It seems to me the most pressing question that we should be addressing is how do we find mechanisms to inject some democracy into the whole process that will lead to the result of the negotiation, which will determine our future relationships with Europe. Because if there's not some coordinated effort, both through Parliament and through engendering some broader, genuine national debate, we have the appalling prospect of the Tory party organising some elite negotiations in closed rooms, which will come up with whatever compromise, which may or may not be like some of the ones that the panel has suggested.
What form should this
then just be presented and will go through without any democratic input into the actual
what form should this input take? What form would you have this input take?
I wonder why, for a start, there isn't some petition. I mean, unfortunately, the petition that started wanting retroactive conditions for a referendum is obviously pointless. But what we need is something that will ensure that all the possible options are actually fully debated, and that there's some more grown-up conversation is held about them than the referendum debate, which was based on fallacies and lies.
Thank you. Let's hear from the person who's got the microphone now. Yep.
The point that I was going to make is slightly linked to the last point, in the sense that I wonder whether there's an extent to which, although the issue of how we act now in Europe is pertinent and important, really what was larger in people's minds during the referendum was the state of our own politics and how we do it in this country. And maybe we could devote some time to talking about how we might reform that first before we look at the wider issue of where we are in Europe. And I wonder if maybe the leader of an opposition, who sadly hasn't addressed that point yet, would make great inroads with the electorate if they made that speech and tried to connect with the people in the country that feel that.
Okay, thank you. I'm quite keen to get a gender balance. I'm seeing a lot of men with their hands up. There's a woman there, I think. Keep your hand up, that's great, and we'll get... Oh, there you are. Oh, and you're there. You know, I couldn't see. I'm very glad you shouted, because I wouldn't have seen with the lighting being where you are. The person in the gallery, who's got... If you've got the microphone, why don't you use it?
Okay, I've got a very basic question.
Yeah.
I was awoken this morning by my nephew, who is 18. He voted Remain, because we told him to vote Remain. Okay? And he believed that he was doing the right thing. And he's got Asperger's, so he has difficulty grasping some of the things that we take for granted. And he was sobbing his heart out. And both his mother and I spent about an hour trying to reassure him. And nothing worked. And I now feel, I'm heartened by some of the suggestions that the panel have come up with, but I still don't know what to go back and say to my nephew about not just his future, because he's not just worried about his future, because we tried that tact. He's worried about the whole future. And he's one of these kids spends a lot of time in his bedroom on the internet. So he's had all that stuff on the internet, and he thinks the world is going to end. Right. What do I go back and say to my nephew, Kyle?
Thank you for that question. Let's begin with that, because that was in a way where I was trying to go with that last section, to try and give something, I'm not going to go as far as saying positive, but something at least concrete that we can sort of hold on to. I think Paul has offered a kind of quite practical thought. Gary, I don't know whether we talked with you about this, about what, for people who do feel, and you saw what the room was like, do feel in some ways quite passionate and even emotional about the attachment to Europe and the consequences of being out of it. It may not be reassurance, but what can we give to the questioner for her to take back to her nephew? There's something to hold on to.
Yeah, I mean, it won't be immediately reassuring, because I don't think there's anything that we can do to turn the clock back. But what I do think we can do, I think if you want a future, you've got to fight for it. And that we have so much to fight for now. And there is, can join a local anti-racist campaign. That was an issue. They could become involved with local immigrant support groups. That is an issue. That we have to, in a range of ways, deal with the debts that came due during this campaign that we have not dealt with before. Now, I don't think there is one single pro-European campaign that we, could all agree on or be part of. But in a range of ways, if all of that 48% of people exercise their civic potential to be engaged in their communities, to be engaged with their parties, to be engaged, whatever it is that your nephew was crying about, whatever it is in particular that he feared, I would say, go face that fear. Join the thing that will combat that fear. Slay that demon and then move on. We've been collectively in our bedrooms on the internet far too long, thinking, assuming, as so many people did a couple of days before, it'll be all right. It'll be all right. We'll get there. And we didn't get there. And so we have to actually get out there and make the difference.
On those lines, go on, yes. Briefly taking off my invisible chair's hat for 1 second. On those, I think that what Gary said, I really want to reinforce that, and I agree with that. It really struck me, this demonstration in the last couple of days for Remain, where it was in Parliament, I think, or outside Parliament, where it was a big crowd, and I thought to myself, why didn't that happen before June the 23rd? Why did you wait till now? And I understand why, and in a way, that 48% is only now really making its voice heard, because they were in the metaphorical bedroom before and did assume that this was going to go the right way. Almost everyone thought that, even including people who voted Leave. And I think that now there probably will be a Conservative Prime Minister who will be doing these negotiations. They so often get the pressure from the people who are on the other side, who are telling them, for example, on migration, you cannot have any compromise that allows free movement. They very rarely get pressure from the other side, from the Remain side, that is saying to them in those negotiations, we want you to come back with something that allows us an economic future and allows us some place in Europe. So, your nephew's voice and other voices like that need to be in the minds of the people doing the negotiating. Because at the moment, all they have is, in a way, the Daily Mail and the other voices who are very loud, and this voice has been silent. So I think, going forward, we have to be very loud and audible in saying that we want some relationship with Europe and we don't want that being negotiated away. So I think we have to speak about that a bit too.
Can I add? Because I think this has been one of the big issues in Britain for such a long time, is I don't know if somebody ideologically has planted it in our head to get us to just think about ourselves as individuals. We stop thinking about ourselves as communities and how we operate and act together. I take my own time and I do a lot of work in prisons. I do a lot of work with disaffected youth in Young Offenders Institute, and that's off my own back. So I think it is the whole community thing. I cannot impress on people enough how important it is that we come together, and we come together in all our different areas. And I think it's all right for people to demonstrate in Parliament, but I think this is a message that needs to go across the country.
Sure. Thank you. I want to make sure the question is, the first question about the media. So Anushka, why don't you take that? The role of the media. I think in fairness to the panel, John did touch on that and talked about those front pages that you can't help but notice in the newsagent with this drumbeat about migration. But during the campaign, it was played up as a sort of Tory squabble, Boris versus Cameron and school chums and the Bullingdon Club and all that. And maybe even the broadcasters, the questioner said, didn't really take it seriously enough.
I mean, there was a great frustration in the Remain camp with the media. David Cameron found out what it was like to be on the other side for the first time, to the Sun, to the Daily Mail, etc. Normally, they are fighting for him. And they were very frustrated with the broadcasters because they felt that there would be this one very, very strong argument, and in the name of balance, the BBC would put it up against what the Remainers thought was a ridiculous argument. And so they thought that the Vote Leave voice got massively amplified as a result of that. I think to some extent, you can blame the media. I think to some extent, this will go down as one of the kind of most disingenuous referendums that we have ever had. You know, yes, there were lies. The 350 million was clearly a lie. But there were lies on the Remain side too. Already 2 of them broken. The Prime Minister wasn't going to resign. Article 50 was going to be triggered immediately. The punishment budget. The punishment budget. I mean, what were they thinking to some extent, that they were threatening to raise income tax, inheritance tax in those final weeks? And I was actually talking to pollster who did a lot of work for Stronger In about what happened, what went wrong. And one of the things that they said is they failed to articulate the economic argument in a way that people could relate to in any way. You know, there were all these acronyms, but actually he thought till the very end that yes, everybody in the country cares about immigration, or nearly everybody, but they don't care about it so much that they will wreck the economy. And what he said was, we were wrong. They cared about it even more because we didn't persuade them on the economic argument. So I think that is a big problem. I just think, just on the other thing on the media, it was interesting because I was in a thing with someone from The Sun quite a few weeks before the end, and I thought The Sun were going to fudge it. I did not think they were going to come out as strongly for leave, because not only do The Sun want to represent their readers, who were outers, more often than not, they also wanted to get it right. And on the day that The Sun came out with their front cover, I suddenly thought, it's going to be Brexit, because The Sun must have been convinced by that time. And although I don't think the print media is as powerful as some people do, I do think that, my God, some of the papers campaigned for out in this.
Okay. This thing about injecting democracy into the decision, in a way we've touched on that with the movement, with the answers about community involvement and public demonstrations addressed to the questioner's nephew. Do you want to, John, though, pick up on this notion of the media and particularly the way they read these Remain warnings? This thing about the economy, presumably what you would say based on what you said earlier was these warnings of dire economic consequences didn't work because people already felt their life was pretty dire economically.
Yeah. When we were in Stoke-on-Trent, after Friday prayers, we went around a couple of mosques in an area of Stoke-on-Trent called Cobridge. And there's a bit in the video we made where a fellow who's just come out of Friday prayers, a 20-something young man, says, it doesn't matter what happens, you know. Cobridge is always the same. It doesn't matter what happens here. He goes, it's just a crap hole. That's what he said, you know. I don't think it was quite as bad as that, but that was what he felt. So that didn't cut much ice. But also, no one's really listening, you know. This is the thing about political reporting, particularly the broadcast media. I cannot overestimate my sense, or overstate my sense that people don't listen, and there are reasons for this. So the first thing is, it struck me watching the ITV News, it could have equally been the BBC News, the night before the referendum. And Raggy Omar came on, in this ill-fitting suit. He looked like David Byrne in Stop Making Sense. I don't know what was going on there at all, but the whole thing
it's been a long week.
The whole thing seemed very, very surreal.
We're all tired.
And it was like it was an election. That's what they seemed to think. So the first thing was Boris Johnson with the cow, right? This is how surreal. I mean, it was this. I was very tired, so the David Byrne suit wasn't helping. But then Boris Johnson with a cow, and then the obligatory Boris having a pint. And there were about 2 or 3 minutes of Boris photo ops. And that was the case throughout the campaign. So I was thinking, well, hold on a minute, this is meant to be a really important decision here. And then they brought Robert Peston on, and the first question he was asked was, what's the mood like in the respective camps? That's what they said. I thought, I'd like to know what the mood was like in Birmingham and Bristol and Leicester, Herefordshire, and there was none of that at all. Now, if that's the way it was framed, that they thought it was an election and it was these two groups of politicians duking it out, people wouldn't have picked up in huge measure the importance of it, all of these issues that were at stake. I want to answer just one other point that a gentleman down there talked about reforming politics. I think we're probably going to need a new political party out of this, right? I've got a column in tomorrow's paper saying this. I think the Labour Party is a 20th century party adrift in the 21st century. I think that probably applies to the Corbynites just as much as the Blairites. There's not much to choose from in that regard. They're both hopelessly out of touch, right? If we're going to have a new party, a new settlement, a new sort of progressive alliance, as Paul talks about, the first thing it has to do is fix the electoral system. And here's why. Here's why. Because so much of this, of course, people in Merthyr Tydfil don't all say, I want proportional representation, but I tell you what, they say, nobody listens to me, I'm voiceless. And they say the same thing in these rock-solid Tory seats as well, and it was a big part of this referendum. So we need a federal UK, or what remains of it, as part of that path to greater democracy, but for God's sake, if you want to avoid any rupture akin to this happening in the future, we need PR, and we need it quick.
Really quick, because I want to get this
I
moving.
think here's the problem about, about media, democracy, etc. Look, there's just a thing missing, a framing device. It's the global economy. And I just want you to all focus on this for a second. I think this has been as big as it could be May 1940 in the Norway debate, or 1931 when we left the gold standard. It's a massive, massive event. And it is big, and therefore your nephew or anybody who's really worried about it are right. It's a major turning point. But here's the problem. The global economy is facing stagnation. And I've been predicting since 2008, and intensely predicting for 2 years, that if we don't break from austerity, what happens is that globalization will break up, because people will just associate it with the terrible outcomes. Now, I think this, you'll hear the Tories saying, this is more globalization, we'll be Singapore. No, this is a step back from the local form of globalization towards a leap in the dark towards a national solution. Now, my fear is that the levels of stagnation that are coming down the line anyway, which will be exacerbated by this breakup, mean that what might have to frame politics is we have to ask ourselves, what is the solution for Britain? And I don't relish it. I want to be an internationalist and a globalist. But my study of economic history tells me that the people who defend the front trench in a trench warfare are brilliant until it gets overrun. And then some of them work out, move to the next trench. And others go, no, I've always been in this trench, I must stay here. And I think what's happening in British politics, is to come to your question, madam, is that we're at that, in this last week, we're at that moment. And I think, my hunch is that I and people like me will have to move to the second trench. And the second trench is what is good for the United Kingdom. Because we tried what was good for Europe. And I'm sorry to say it, but if I don't say it as a leftist, I know what happened in the 30s. First person to say it was Oswald Mosley, as a Labour MP who became an independent and then a fascist. And if we don't say it in the way that the Keynesians then say it, like we have a progressive way of doing this, then the people who will dominate this debate, and and the BBC will be following them with 52%, they'll give them airtime, are the people who are actually economic nationalists.
Okay, let's get another round of questions in. Gentleman here has been waiting a long time. Gentleman over here, yeah, that's it. Let's get the microphone to him.
Nobody's mentioned general election. Why should we not have a general
Okay, but let's give, good, you got that out there. Let's go to the guy who's been waiting a long time. We'll put that here, don't worry, I'll make a note of it. And then can we get the microphone to this lady here in the middle? Keep your hand up, yeah. Okay.
Two things, really. Firstly, to Drita, I can tell you why society is so fractured. We once had a lady who was a leader, and I've forgotten her name, no doubt people will remind me, who said quite clearly, there's no such thing as society. Now, what she meant, actually, was that we are all individuals, and we look after our individual families and our individual selves. And she discounted all the ways in which we, as a society, move and flux together. Now, that was a stupid statement. But it is proving a very popular theme that is taking over our country. People are only thinking about what's good for themselves. That's my first thing. The second, could I ask...
Very quickly, yeah.
Very, very quickly. Could I ask, and Drita was the only person, I think, who has alluded to this, what are we going to do about the basic right of shelter for every individual in this country and the opportunity of a good day's salary for a good day's work? Are we going, do we try and address the widening gap that's been going on for 25, 30, 35 years between the extremely rich and the rest of us? And I include the comfortable middle class in that. But there's a huge gap now between the extremely rich and a huge proportion of less well-off people who have not basic housing and have not got a good day's pay for a good day's work.
Thank you. Let's hear from the woman here. Yeah.
Me?
Yes. And well, sorry, just before you start, because I want to get the question lined up. Is there a hand up here? Yes, lady there. Just near you. Please, go ahead.
It was marvellous to see everyone saying that this was all down to the disenfranchised working class. Where have you been for 30 years? Where have you been? Where have London people been? John's brilliant. He goes and he talks and talks and talks.
So does Paul.
Well, it's more theoretical, and he's more economics.
It's not quite as bad as that.
He's still talks a bit too much as economic man for me. I'm Sheffield. All my relatives are in Sheffield. Others were in Lincolnshire, in Boston, actually, and Wales. That's my background. Nobody's spoken for them for so long, they've turned off politics. I've got one brother who's BNP. I didn't speak to him for 5 years. So I don't think people have an inkling of what's been going on for the last 35 years. The people that voted most Brexit went back to the 70s and 80s recession. Those were the people that are still affected, and their children are affected, and probably their grandchildren are affected. This was as it was because it was a referendum. Every vote counted.
Yeah, totally.
It wasn't PR, but it was every vote. And people forgot. It was like the BBC did treat it like an election. They thought it was two parties somehow.
Yeah, they did.
And they got it completely wrong.
Totally.
Because every vote counted.
Yep.
So I voted with my family. I was very undecided, but in the end I said solidarity with them. And I'm moving to Sheffield, actually.
You mean you voted leave?
I voted leave after going back to the forwards 1,000 times, and I'm going to leave London now. I've decided to go back to Sheffield because that is where the work. I could have done voluntary service overseas, and I thought, no, actually, plenty to do in Sheffield.
Good.
And I hope other people do that. That Sheffield, that these places haven't had the educated people like me who left, went into the professions. I've been here 25 years. I don't feel any more welcome here now than as I did 25 years ago. I do not get on with the London middle class. They are so self-satisfied, it's unbelievable. They worry about their kids not being able to travel around Europe or get jobs where they like. One woman came to my door in tears because her daughter is going to lose her very highfalutin job in Vienna. Well, I can't cry for these people, to be honest. But, you know, the people that I know, including my nephew, didn't get an education, and he's still in a minimum hours job, wage job at 37.
Right.
You know, you don't get it. And what happened in the 70s is you didn't train the 50% who were never going to go to university.
You didn't
train them to German standards.
Dead right.
And therefore, it's much better to get graduates from the continent to do those jobs.
Don't interpret it as disagreement. I just want to make sure we get some other people in. Do pass the microphone perhaps to this guy here who's been waiting quite a lot, but I know that somebody's got the microphone already. This will be you, and then we're going to bring it back here. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to pick up two things that Gary said, if I might. Firstly, he said you can't put the clocks back. What I'd like to put out, the clocks haven't gone forward yet.
Yeah.
Article 50 has not yet been triggered. Nick Clegg last night called for a general election before Article 50 is triggered. I got in first. I got a petition being prepared right now. I've done the necessary. I'm waiting for the government people to put it online. So that's a bit of publicity.
So you would like a
democratic mandate. The second thing that Gary said was Boris's jolly jig. Now, so this is totally new, but it's another way. I see this as another way forward. I see it as a feeling way forward. When someone has boxed themselves into a corner, I don't think he wants to trigger Article 50 either. When someone's boxed themselves into a corner, you help them get it out of it. Can we do that somehow?
And do you have a thought yourself about how that might happen?
Sadly, I'm not clever enough to do that.
I'm sure you are.
Other brains are around that should surely find a way of getting him out of his corner.
Yeah. Interesting. I've got a thought on that I might bring up later on. Yes,
Hello
gentleman
there.
here, you've been waiting.
There's one thing I haven't heard this evening, which is the political vacuum that Corbyn has allowed the Conservative government to debate, to organise, and we are allowing the Conservative government, if we go forward and the Labour government continues on its current path, will determine the agenda of the working class people for the next 10 to 15 years. We live in a post-industrial economy, a knowledge economy. It is up to another government, whether John Harris was talking about it being someone other but Labour, but if someone doesn't talk through and develop an infrastructure for what unskilled or people who aren't working in the knowledge economy will do to have a job and to live and to develop, the rest of the country, it will be down to Boris and his team. And I'm sure no one wants that. Somebody has to bring Labour to its senses.
Okay, pass the microphone, just 2 rows in front. Yep, it's to you. And this gentleman here, right in the front row, and this will be the last one before we bring it back here. Oh, I'll bring you in as well. But go on, yes.
Thank you very much. Now, despite or because of the chaos enveloping 2 major political parties, is an early general election either desirable or inevitable?
Thank you. So general election theme is coming up, and we're going to pass the microphone 3 rows behind you. This is going to be the lady there is just well placed. So we'll hear this, and then we're going to hear from our panel in some closing thoughts. Yes.
Okay. I am actually a product of the European experiment. When you asked at the beginning who voted Leave, who voted Remain, I couldn't put my hand up for either. I have a German passport. I worked in Germany. I had an education in Germany. I came to Britain for the only reason is because I married an English guy, and I wanted to build a future here. All the rhetoric that I've been hearing about Leave, about Remain, has been alienating, it's been divisive, it's been hurtful, and I really think that it's not getting any better. I sympathise 100% with the comments that have been made about the disenfranchised people who have been left behind, who are lost. Because when I was, I'm starting a new business, that was my idea, to start a new business and to frame it under the umbrella of Made in Britain. Because I went to Leicester to do some courses at the university. The lecturer there was showing me around all the buildings of places that had been, businesses that had shut down, people who'd left the industry. There was nobody I could find to do sewing. There's nobody I could find to join my pattern cutting course because there was no need. He talked about how Marks and Spencer's turned their back on their industry, on British industry from one day to the next and sent everything to China. And all those industries, all that knowledge, all that heritage of hundreds of years, well, you know what I mean, has gone, has been left. And I'm just wondering, how can you rebuild that? And the thing is, people are suffering and blaming the EU on all their suffering. And I'm saying, well, the EU's not the problem, it's a homegrown problem. And it is a problem that has been in place and hasn't been addressed since Thatcher and even since then.
Can I just ask you, there's been a lot of coverage in the last week of this rise of hate crime attacks on Polish immigrants and others, but there's been this discussion about European nationals who are living in Britain and how they feel, I'm just interested in your own personal perspective 1 week on, whether you feel this is a less hospitable place to people who weren't born in Britain, and is that going to change your own feelings about this country?
Well, I live in London, so I live in that London bubble that is more tolerant. All my friends voted Remain. All the people I know are open, tolerant, and I haven't ever experienced any kind of racist attacks or issues personally. But to be honest, I wouldn't ever want to live in places outside of London. No, seriously. It's
not that bad, you know.
No, seriously.
It's all right. It's all right.
It's the same thing. No. It's the same thing that I would say about living in places in Germany where they burn down refugee homes and so on. I would never go and live in Magdeburg, for instance. You know, they're just places. Even as a black person, you cannot go and live and feel safe.
Okay.
So that's an issue. So
Okay.
in London, it's been fine.
Good, thank you. We're going to have to end it there. And I'm sorry that people, not end the whole evening, but we're not going to be able to take any more contributions. I'm sorry, it's just we've only got 5 minutes on the clock for closing thoughts from our panel. There's a lot there to bite on. This thing about a general election came up 2 or 3 times. Before we get into whether or not it's a good idea, Anushka, is it on the cards in any scenario you can see?
Well, neither Boris Johnson nor Theresa May are suggesting that they would have an early general election. The reason they are not suggesting that is it turns out Tory MPs who just got their jobs don't want an early general election. especially those who are up against Lib Dems, who, by the way, are going to be offering the chance to return into the EU. So in order to get them in their camps, which they're trying to do right now, they have both said there will be no early general election. It doesn't mean it definitely won't happen. We saw what happened with Gordon Brown. People might think that they need a mandate. And earlier I said that I didn't think there'd be a second referendum. I don't think it's absolutely impossible if the deal is such that people are angry and feel that it is necessary.
But Anushka,
So
the 2 or 3 people who mention it seem to mention a general election as a way of somehow of getting a fresh mandate for staying in Europe. Surely the only way that could work is if you literally had 2 parties, one called Remain, one called Leave. Because if you vote Conservative, it depends. If you're voting for Ken Clarke, that's Remain. If you're voting for Boris Johnson, well, who knows what it's for? But
No,
you know
I mean,
what I mean? It's not clear, is it?
It could only work in certain scenarios. So first of all, it could work if the Labour Party, whatever the Labour Party is by then, offered a mandate to remain in the EU. I think that is very unlikely because of the disconnect between Labour and many of its heartlands as a result of this referendum.
So in a way, a general election wouldn't resolve anything in terms of this issue?
The other argument is if the Lib Dems do so well that they could go back into coalition and that they could then use it as a thing. Remember, Boris Johnson wanted a second referendum. That was his starting point. He wanted to take us to the brink so that we got the reforms that he thought that we needed to get. So he might be Prime Minister. He might say, here's the deal, let's put it back to you now. It's not impossible. And can I just make one tiny point on the argument about different parts of the country and how people feel? I don't think this is the only reason that London voted Remain. I think London is a different place. There's a different type of demographic, etc. But as somebody who has lived in London recently and grew up in a completely different part of the country, up north in a place called Stalybridge, voted very heavily out, I would say there are very good public services these days. You've got amazing schools, you've got amazing hospitals to have your children in, you've got housing's a problem. You've got housing's a problem, but otherwise you've got pretty good public services. And I do wonder if that does reduce some of the anxiety in London that exists in other parts of the country.
Thank you. Who wants to pick up? There were several things there, but one of them, and I'm looking at either Gary or Paul. Questioner there said the political vacuum in which the Tories are allowed to call all the shots has partly been created because of Jeremy Corbyn. I think that's what the questioner said, and he's nodding, so I think I got that right. Paul, you've been a stout defender of Jeremy Corbyn on the airwaves in the last few days, accusing Labour MPs of sniggering behind his back. I did. That was a big moment. Why don't you just pick up that question?
I mean, I've spent more than that. I've spent quite a bit of this week trying to sort it out as well. So for me, Corbyn has always been a placeholder. He'd be 71 in 2020 when we thought the election was going to be. And what I always wanted was for Corbyn to create a new kind of politics and then a new generation of centre-left people to come forward and make the Labour Party, which is what the critical issue is, non-neoliberal. It has got to stop inflicting all this stuff we've all decided we don't like. Blair and Brown inflicted it. They were the ones who reduced some towns to dependency on welfare, and then the Tories cut welfare, and then goodbye social cohesion. So I want Labour to be a non-neoliberal party. And the EEA question, it's going to be really concrete. So I'm supporting him now because I think that what is coming is, all the people who are going to try and challenge him are not Blairites, but the intent and the money will come from Blair, and I think that's over. In the end, this is the short-term issue. The Tories will come forward with a 30 billion plus cut to the budget, so they'll have to raise taxes and cut public spending. People who want, Caitlin Moran wants a centrist Labour Party, wants you all to join it to make it centrist. And I respect Caitlin. All I want to say is, what is centrism?
Sorry, who are you quoting?
Caitlin Moran.
Caitlin Moran.
Yep.
Yeah.
I would say, what is centrism? Is centrism, we cut only 20 billion, or as McDonnell wants to do, we expand public spending. We borrow more and we we monetary stimulate. So we take the Bank of England and we print double what we've already done. And then when it comes to public services, who gets them? This time, is it going to be Lee, Stalybridge, etc.? And I think that I want Labour to reconnect with that issue of what does a non-neoliberal economic policy look like. Okay. And if somebody turns up who's got one, I'll listen to them. But I know I've been sitting in a room with somebody who has one all week, which is John McDonnell. And until he hears something better than that, that's why I'm sticking with them.
Thank you. Drida, I noticed what I thought was a bit of sort of eye rolling on your part at the beginning of that from Paul. Can you just vocalise what was going on across your face?
I mean, we're both on the left, and I'm a Labour voter. I've always been a Labour voter. And I just think it's not about Jeremy Corbyn. It's just what we've got at the moment has not worked. You know, essentially what you had was someone who was a leader who for how many years said, get out of Europe, and then all of a sudden not get out of Europe. I mean, how was the Labour heartland meant to take that? They're not stupid voters. No one believed that. I didn't believe that. And I think he and his party had such an opportunity and a mandate for social change, for the poor and the disenfranchised, and he and his party blew it. And you know what? As a Labour voter, that breaks my heart.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what you said. Yeah, all of a sudden, you can't wake up one morning and expect everyone to say, oh, yeah, I really believe you, because I didn't.
Okay. A closing thought. You've heard all the different questions. Pick up any one of them you like, Gary.
What's
you could pick up the thought about the woman who said she feels comfortable in London but wouldn't in the rest of the country, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I know exactly where you're coming from. I've made a decision to feel comfortable in my skin wherever I am, and if that makes other people uncomfortable, that's really, going to be their problem. I feel that we fetishize the difference between London, but let's not forget, London elected Boris. So how different are we actually? It might be 98% of this room voted Remain, but 40% of London voted Leave. And there is this tying in that people do with London and elites and wealth. Well, a lot of people in London are poor and struggling. And so there are a range of ways in which I think with this result, we can rush to very simplistic conclusions that people were wrong, or they were stupid, or they were duped, or they didn't vote in their own interest. When I don't vote in my own, when I vote Labour and I vote for higher taxes, I'm not voting in my economic interest. I'm voting because there's something more and bigger that I want for the world than what's good for me. And it's ridiculous to think that other people might not be doing that, even if they're voting the other way. The thing that really scared me about this election was this referendum was that it reminded me of the 2004 election in America between George Bush and John Kerry. That it wasn't just that we were disagreeing with each other, it was that we didn't know each other. And so that it wasn't just a London bubble, there were a range of bubbles, and they didn't really mix. And so coming out of this moment, we are going to have to reimagine who we are as a country, what our place is in the world, what our relationship is to each other, and what our duties and responsibilities are to each other. Because if we'd won, if we'd remained, we would never be talking about those people who were left behind. We would have forgotten them, we would have said, well, great, let's move on. And we've been forced in an ugly way, in a very ugly way, to face our demons and to tame those demons. And we can't move on until we do.
Very good. We're already in injury time, so I'm going to let you close.
A lot of goals are scored in injury time.
They are, but to keep it as brief as you can before we close and let these good people go home.
Okay. I'll say three things very quickly. The big divide that sits under this is between the 1% and the 99%, and an economic system which has gone out of control as far as inequality is concerned. But inequality as it's manifested culturally in everyday life is more complicated than that. And Gary talked about different bubbles. And the big bubble it struck me in this election, which is visible to everybody, is between a middle class who are largely educated, have cultural capital, make sure their kids go to the right schools and go to after-school clubs and all the rest of it, and the people that we've described as the left behind. And we live that out every day, a lot of us, right? And we are partly responsible for that. If you're the sharp-elbowed middle-class parent, if you stand outside the school gates and under your breath you make jokes about the chavs and the pikeys who stand over there, then you're part of that problem. And I think we have to think about that. It's no good saying we're the 99% and they're the 1%. Inequality is something that we have a responsibility for as well. That's one point. That's not even my point. John Domokos, my colleague, is thinking a lot about this. Second thing is just about the Labour Party. The dreadful state of the Labour Party, the demise of the Labour Party, its absolute implosion, it seems at the moment, isn't Jeremy Corbyn's fault. Okay? I don't think he's helping, but that's a different thing. If you look at these so-called core Labour areas, which we'll have to stop calling core Labour areas very soon, the vote share of the Labour Party has been coming down steadily since 2001. Tony Blair, by 2005, had the support of 22% of the total electorate. As I said earlier, the trade unions are in abeyance. Unfortunately, the nonconformist church no longer exists. The industrial base of the Labour Party is gone. There is a crisis of centre-left social democratic parties all across Europe. This is systemic. It's not a British thing. In places like Spain, they've begun to answer it with the arrival of Podemos. There are other forces which are starting to rear their heads. In Italy, these very creative independents now running cities. Something similar will have to happen here, right? But it's going to be a long haul. Eleanor Rathbone, my stock line, started agitating for universal child benefit in 1917. She got it in 1945. It took a long time for us to get to that progressive socialist watershed. And so it will probably prove in this case. It's going to be a 10, 15, 20-year project. But worthwhile things often are. But here's a note of optimism. The man up in the gods there said he thought we'd become individualized. It's not my experience. Wherever I go, there are really deep, strong feelings of community and so on, and you see them very powerfully. And that's not the preserve of Remain people. A lot of people voted Leave because they feel very strongly about community and cohesion and bonds running between people and so on. We're not an atomized society at all. And that's what we have to seize on and build on. Politics goes on, right? And I think in the end, the good will out, but it's going to be very, very difficult getting there. So it's a mixture, really, of optimism for the long term. All bets are off. We live in a world in which anything can happen. But what we cannot do is switch off from the rest of the country and sort of bury ourselves under a carapace of self-righteousness. That's the big danger at the moment. We lost. Why did we lose? And there are progressive answers to that, and it's time we came up with them.
Okay. Good. I'm not sure we completely answered the question above there, Brexit, what happens next, but we certainly had a very good go. I think this was a really interesting and enriching conversation. Absolutely made better by all the contributions that we had time to include. I'm sure you're going to want to join me in thanking our panelists, Anushka Asthana, John Harris, Gary Younge, Drita Mitchell, Paul Mason. Thank you all very much. Good night. Thanks.
Skin apart. Time to go.